Today we're going to talk about figures, perspectives, and configurations. And by doing that, we're going to be talking uh, about a slightly smaller scale, a more microcosmic level of script analysis. So far, we've talked about really big forms, overarching plots, entire stories, the entire dramatic text. And now we're going to start to break down and look at some of the smaller portions of the text, and that makes up that overall play. So let's start off by defining the terms figure, perspective, and configuration. Figure refers to the subject of a story, meaning the primary figure, the figure or the number of figures that are represented in a story, particularly in a dramatic text. As we've said, figures are often human, or they are at least somewhat humanized. So if it's about a penguin, the penguin is somehow sort of like a human, or they're personified. So a virtue might be personified, or evil might be personified. Anyway, these figures are human-like, and they are the subjects of dramatic texts. Now, each of these figures has a perspective on its reality. And so when we talk about perspectives, we're talking about the figure's perspective on the world in which they exist. So the figure's opinions, emotional reactions, thoughts, feelings, and etc. And these things all rise in response to the situation that they find themselves in every moment of the dramatic text. And then finally, configuration is the portion of the dramatis personae, and meaning the cast of figures in the play. Configuration refers to the portion of that entire cast that is on stage at any given moment. So if the play has 10 characters, in one moment there might be one character on stage, and one moment there might be 3 figures on stage, and in another moment there might even be 0 figures on the stage. So all of those are different configurations, and plays are move along through a series of figure configurations. So the figure is, unlike a human being, entirely identified and defined by its function within a play. And that's not unlike a chess piece in a game of chess. The pieces really exist to move and do things in a certain way. And how they are moved, that's the choice of the chess player. Likewise, the figure is kind of like a chess piece, and it's given individual characteristics by some things that the playwright writes, and even more so by the actor that portrays them. And the figure perspective, this can be obvious and it can be less obvious. This image right here I chose because we see in the front that we're really just looking at somebody's hand, but if somebody had a terrible fear of hands or shadows, they might perceive that. Their perspective might be that there was something very scary in front of them. So figure perspective helps us to understand the way a figure is reacting to the world in which they exist. And then as we see configurations, and we'll talk more about this later, but configurations impact what happens on the stage. So if there's a single actor on a stage, there isn't a lot of room for multiple conflicting perspectives. But if we have a lot of different people on the stage, representing conflicts becomes much easier, because the different actors and the different figures can counteract each other. So let's talk about some common qualities of figures. First of all, figures usually don't realize that they're in a play. That's pretty common. Most of the time when we see a play, the figures aren't really aware that the audience is there. And the actor playing the figures has to, for that reason, pretend that they don't know that the audience is there. Though there are exceptions to this. Sorry about that. Usually figures, like as I said, don't know the audience is there. And each figure in a dramatic text is entirely defined by their purpose that it plays within in the play. So it's a figure is reducible to a microstructural unit that exists to change or stabilize the dramatic situation, and by doing so either slow down or speed up the plot as it goes barreling towards the end of the piece. Because figures usually don't know the audience is there, they usually remain inside of what I've referred to as the internal communication system, and that is the communication in the world of the play itself. The figures in the play talk to each other, but they don't necessarily turn and talk to the audience directly, though, as you probably know, there are many exceptions to that. But in the most common situation, figures in plays just speak on that internal communication system, and they don't enter the external system by directly addressing the audience most of the time. But we'll talk about more situations in which that does happen later. And figures usually know either more or less than the audience does about the world of the play. And the truth is, in most cases, the audience knows more about what's happening in the play than the figures do. This is called superior awareness. Having more awareness about what's going on than someone else in the play. So, for instance, when we see the play Hamlet, we know that Hamlet is devising a plot to capture the current king in a trap of guilt, and the king does not know that. And because of that, we have superior awareness that we share with Hamlet in that play. Characterization. Character, and this now we're getting to the place where I am going to remind you that I try to use the word figure to describe what most people call characters in plays, because figures are pieces that move around and make things happen. But the character of that figure is determined by what the character says, what the character does, and also how the actor plays that figure. I should say that again with the word figure. Because I wrote character on here and it should say figure. Character is exhibited by what the figure says, what the figure does, and how the actor portrays the figure in performance. So I see that I messed that up on the slide, but I'll go back and fix that and when I send you the slide. Characterization is the process of using words and actions to make a figure unique and reveal its special purpose in the dramatic text. And the character of the figure can be defined as the sum of the contrasts, the deviations, and also the correspondences linking it with the other figures in the dramatic text. And one interesting thing here, and it's a technique that has worked for me and that I think might be good for you, is that whenever we're looking at anything in a play, if there are a bunch of set pieces, if there are a bunch of props, if there are a bunch of figures, a bunch of sounds, usually it's what's different or deviating about each of these sounds that gives us a clue about what that particular object or figure's purpose is in a play. We can talk about that in more detail later. But looking for what makes a figure or an object distinct is usually the first tip-off to what that figure's function is in the play. And then figures sometimes characterize themselves. Let's talk about, we're not talking about words so much yet, but we'll talk about actions. Implicit figural self-characterization. So figures often show their own deviations and they characterize themselves not only by what they say, but also how they say it, by their appearance, by their behavior, and also by the situations in which they find themselves and how they respond to those situations. So figures in plays often offer their own kind of self-characterization. An actor will read a play over and over and over and over to try to get characterization information about the figure that they are portraying. And often what they're looking for is what's different about this figure, what is special about this figure. Figural perspectives. That figural perspective refers to a figure's opinions, emotional reactions, thoughts, feelings in response to what happens in the dramatic text, and also in response to the perspectives of other figures within the text. One thing that I like to point out when I'm talking about figural perspectives is that perspectives, opinions, fears, these are all nouns. They are things. So they can be changed or they can be maintained. And so this, you may have heard the phrase before, every word in a play, everything a figure says is actually, it's not just a statement, it's an action. And I think understanding that perspectives are things, they are nouns that can be changed and dealt with, is the key to understanding that idea that words are actions. Usually in a play, when a figure speaks to another figure, they are either trying to maintain a perspective in another figure, or they are trying to somehow change a perspective in another character. So they're not only trying to change the physical world. It's not only about picking up a cup, picking up a glass, going after someone with a knife or something. These are all actions, but words themselves are actions. And if we read words carefully in a play, we discover that there's virtually nothing figures say that is not meant to affect another perspective held by another figure. So much of the dramatic effect of theater is rooted in the efforts of one or more figure to actually impact, change, or stabilize the perspective of another figural perspective that they're dealing with. So figural perspectives reveal many, many things about figures, and some of these things are the psychological state of the figure, the emotional temperament of the figure. Are they hot-headed? Are they relaxed? Their ideological orientation. Are they very religious, or are they rather really wild and irreligious? But all those ranges of different ideological orientations. We learn how intelligent a character is by their perspective. We learn how knowledgeable they actually are. We learn how easy or difficult it is to change their mind when they hold an opinion. And we also know how they respond to both disagreement and agreement. And all of these things are linked to a figure's perspective, and they tell us a lot about the figure. And these are just a few examples. That's by no means everything. So perspective can have different levels of depth. Some perspectives are very surface, very superficial, and some perspectives are very deep. Let's look at, and then there are some analytical, there are some structural aspects to perspective that we can talk about as well. So the subordinate perspective refers to figures whose perspectives are entirely inside of the internal communication system of the play. So when we see a figure in a play and they don't know we're there, there's a fourth wall between us and the figures only speak to other figures, and they only know what's going on in the world of the play, and they have no other knowledge about the larger story upon which the play is based. We call that a subordinate perspective. Their perspective is subordinated to the realm of the internal communication system, and to them that is all of existence. Superordinate perspective refers to figures who know more about the story upon which the play is based, and they may even know how the story is going to end. They may even know the audience is there and talk to them. So when we see a narrator who knows that the audience is there and they also know everything that's going on in the minds of the characters of the play, that narrator has what's called a superordinate perspective. It goes beyond the world of the internal communication system. They're in there in that system as well, but they also know we are there and can talk to us. So superordinate perspectives give figures the power to communicate things to the audience that would be difficult to do if the fourth wall remained closed. So manipulating perspectives. A great deal of playwriting is about manipulating perspectives. One perspective that's very interesting is called the authorially intended audience reception perspective. I know it's long. I call it AIARP because it's really hard to write that over and over and over again. So if you're writing something in this class and you decide to use that term, it's fine. Just say AIARP and we'll all know what you're talking about in the discussion board. So the authorially intended audience reception perspective is the perspective or idea that the playwright hopes to communicate to the audience. He's hoping that the audience will receive the play with a particular perspective that is being focused on by the playwright. Perspectival focus. This is indicated in a dramatic text when several different figure perspectives seem to indicate a dominant perspective. And the perspective that is indicated is often the perspective that the playwright's trying to bring to our attention. So if we see a play and there seems to be a lot of people whose different perspectives ultimately reveal a shared idea, such as, for instance, war is terrifying, then we all know that the playwright is probably trying to get us to understand that war is terrifying. So that's what happens with perspectival focus. Now, perspectival perspectival focus can be complicated by perspectival diversity. And perspectival diversity refers to the range of perspectives that are carried around by the various figures in the play. If we have a small group of figures in a play, a small dramatis personae, then we will have less perspectival diversity than we have in the plays of Shakespeare. Shakespeare has many, many different characters, and they're all of different, very, very wide array of different kinds of people. And for that reason, sometimes it's really hard to determine what Shakespeare's intended audience reception perspective is. So the perspectival diversity, the more diverse the perspectives are in a play, the more difficult it might be to put your finger on what the audience, what the playwright is trying to get you to hear. And usually if there are smaller numbers of characters, it's easier to get at the main idea of the play. The author perspectival dramatic structure. So there are some dramatic structures that are rooted in specific and special kinds of perspectives. So the first one we're going to talk about is the author perspectival dramatic structure. And the author perspectival dramatic structure is a dramatic structure in which the figures, for the most part, are a mouthpiece for the audience. I'm sorry, for the author. The characters are more or less delivering a message from the mouth of the author to the audience with very little change. They just kind of speak as a megaphone on behalf of the author. One example of that is the play Everyman. When we read the play Everyman, you will see that it's very clear what the author is trying to tell us about sin and reward and death, and that some basic assumptions about theology are just being handed to us as if those assumptions are absolutely true. The characters don't encourage us to question this theology. It is didactic, and the term didactic means designed to teach a specific thing, right? So author perspectival dramatic structure, such as an Everyman, tends to be designed to teach a very specific lesson, and that lesson isn't really questioned or critiqued. It's just kind of handed to us as truth. So in Everyman, the figure perspectives and the perspective of the author, as you will see, those more or less coincide. Those are the same thing. And this is true, like a lot of medieval theater is written from the author perspectival dramatic structure approach. When we see virtues and vices, they describe who they are and tell us why they're good or bad. It's funny because in some medieval morality plays, this doesn't happen in Everyman, but in some medieval morality plays, even a vice will say, I'm greed. And if you're greedy and you do the things that I encourage you to do, you will go to hell. And so the interesting thing about it is that the vice is there undercutting himself. And that's because the vice is there to deliver a message about vice that the playwright has written, not there to have any kind of subtlety and try to trick you into being greedy. Then we have closed perspective dramatic structure. And really most of the theater that you see and most of the films that you see in TV you see are pretty closed in their perspective. So closed perspective dramatic structure links there are various contrasting and corresponding figure perspectives, and it creates links between them that sort of indicate the authorially intended audience reception perspective. But that perspective is not handed to us like it is in Everyman. Rather, we have to look at all the different perspectives in it and figure out what the author's intended reception perspective was. This kind of playwriting challenges us to use our own moral judgment. It's not didactic. It's not there to tell us what our ethics are, but rather it is there to make us ask our own ethical questions. So in a play like Oedipus and Midsummer Night's Dream, we are there and we get a pretty good idea of what good and bad means in those worlds, and what love means in A Midsummer Night's Dream, and what freedom means in both of those plays, but it's not handed to us on a silver platter all wrapped up with a bow. We have to kind of figure out by reading that what we think the author is intending. And that process of discovering it is part of the enjoyment of the play. Um, and the many different perspectives of the figures in these plays let us see a problem from different angles, and we get a very complex view of the problem and why it's difficult to solve. So, but by the end of the play, we more or less do usually come out from a closed perspective play, understanding what the audience, what the author intended us to perceive as the main perspective of the piece. And then there's open perspective dramatic structure. And in these kinds of plays, there's not a single line of convergence where all the figure perspectives go. So focus is kind of scattered. It's not really there. It's hard for us to determine based on it's almost as if the various figure perspectives are there to disorient us. And that is a technique, to disorient the audience rather than orient the audience. The relationships between figure perspectives, they're just unclear. Their meaning is unclear. Some of them contradict each other without any kind of an apparent unifying idea behind them. And because of this, the intended authorial reception perspective, that is unclear and ambivalent. And there often is an absence of clear rational solutions to the problems that pop up in the play. And it puts us in the situation of not really knowing what the author's intended perspective is, and to create what might be called an unofficial reception perspective. Called unofficial because we decide for ourselves what the point of the play is, but what we decide is not necessarily connected at all to any specific message that the playwright was trying to send. Most of the time in these plays, in fact, the playwright wants us to create these meanings for ourselves. No values or norms are presented. People are not operating because they believe there's some ultimate truth or goodness in the universe, but rather every single different person in the play, in this sort of a play, an open perspective play, every person has their own personally developed ideas about everything, and that's why they would be, it's called perspectival relativity. The idea that each person's perspective is just relative to their own mind and what they think, and not at all connected to any kind of a higher order of right and wrong. And so norms tend to get deconstructed and questioned, and they become problematic and questionable. And when you read Godot, again, this will be, and probably no surprise to you after the last couple lectures, Godot is the play that is the open perspective play. Figure configuration refers to portions of dramatis personae that are present on the stage in the portion of a play. So sometimes there's no people on a stage, sometimes there's 2 people on a stage, sometimes there's 3 people, sometimes there's 50 people, 100 people. Each of those different situations is called a configuration. Now, when the different figures are on the stage with each other, it can create different dramatic effects. And the particular arrangement of characters and their impact on each other is referred to sometimes as a figure constellation. And figure constellations are dramatic effects in a dramatic text that are created by configurations. And the result is the manifestation of conflicts, alliance, direction, changes. So figure constellations are dramatic effect that results from the use of configurations in a play. There are 3 kinds of figure constellations. These relate to actions and events in a play. So a dramatic action, if you remember, is a situation in which a figure attempts to achieve a goal and actually achieves it. And a dramatic event is a situation in a play when a figure attempts to achieve a goal but does not actually achieve it in that particular moment. Likewise, we have positive figure constellations and negative figure constellations. Positive figure constellations are constellations in which 2 or more figures are working together to achieve a dramatic action, and in fact, they do make that action happen. Negative figure constellations is when 1 or more figures interfere with 1 or more other figures' ability to successfully achieve an action, and therefore that results in an event rather than an action. And then we have what are called neutral figure constellations. This is when we have figures that don't really impact each other's story at all. They don't get in the way and they don't help. So for instance, if we have 2 different people at a restaurant, one sitting at one table, one sitting at another, and then we have a waiter, and the waiter interacts with each of those two people, there is a relationship between the waiter and each of those people, but the two people at the separate tables can be entirely separate from each other and not impact each other, and thereby have a neutral relationship with each other. Configuration changes create dramatic effect, and this is because changes in configuration bring about new figure constellations, new dramatic effects. So the more we change, the more potential for drama we have in a piece. A new configuration in the French scene style represents what's called a new scene, right? So a configuration in a play, one character leaves, another character comes on. Anytime a configuration changes, we can say that the scene itself has changed. This can even be viewed this way if we're reading a play and in one scene the constellation or the configuration changes 3 times. As a director or an actor, it makes sense to view those as 3 separate scenes because something dynamic has happened whenever one character leaves or comes in. Another term for this is called French scene, and this is the more traditional way of stating this, is that a French scene begins every time one or more characters enters or leaves. Figure entrances and exits, by the way, are very telling. If we know why a figure is entering or exiting, that can sometimes tell us a lot about what is happening off stage in the present, or might be happening in the future, or might have happened in the past. The very nature of characters entering and exiting with additional information can create a lot of drama as well. Configuration size. The number of figures in a configuration, again, it can be anything. It can range from 0 to 100. And then we have the 0 configuration arrangement. It's a configuration where there's nobody on the stage, and often this is to indicate a passage of time from one day to the next day. The larger the configuration, usually the larger dramatic impact upon the story of the play. And entire cast configurations in large cast plays usually don't happen with a lot of frequency. They're dramatic because in a large cast play, a lot of characters can learn the truth. They can discover something is not true. They can resolve a conflict and see it resolved. They can be witnesses to things that happen. And the more people are on the stage, the more powerful are moments of public exposure of truth and lies. In Shakespeare's plays, often the full cast doesn't enter the stage until the very end of the play when everything gets played out. So configuration size is really important, whereas soliloquy moments are usually private moments where a character is going through their thought and thinking about something that they're going to do, or they're reflecting on something that's happened. Configuration changes can create a sense of time and impact the audience's sense of time. So the duration of a figure configuration, and really of anything else, a person speaking, one person doing something, monologue, dialogue, movement, if something is done for a long time, it impacts the audience's sense of time. An extremely long configuration that stays on stage for a long time can create the sense that time is moving really slowly. And that's because when we're in one situation for a long time and there aren't a lot of changes, our sense of time gets stretched out. On the other side, if configuration changes are very fast and they happen a whole lot, it raises the tempo of the play and it makes time fly by. And this is why when we watch comedies, and also in horror, a lot of times configurations change pretty fast, and that's to keep things dramatic and keep things moving. Configuration structure, the series of configurations that define a particular figure by contrast and correspondences that develop between that one figure and other figures is called configuration structure. So each character, each figure, I should say, has its own configuration structure. And so when you're looking at a play, we should be looking at the way, if you're playing a character or focusing on a character, you should be looking at how that character interacts with the different configurations in the play. Configurations offer meaningful juxtapositions, and that refers to the act of placing figures next to other figures in order to reveal things about their nature and also personal information about them. The overarching configuration structure of a play are all the configurations taken in sequence, looked at from beginning to end, as a whole. So every play has an overarching configuration structure, and that is made up of a lot of little configurations. This is like when I talk about every play has an overarching plot, sequence of events, and that plot is made up of a bunch of smaller plot sequences or action sequences, smaller sequences of events that put together make up the whole plot. One thing that's always interesting is to look at is figure configurations that repeat. These should attract your attention. They're almost ritualistic in nature when you see them, and they usually mean that somebody is trying to show us either the progress of characters or the progress of the plot or some other important thematic element. In Shakespeare's Macbeth, there are those scenes with the three witches, and each of those scenes are dramatically intense, and they do a great deal to show the horror of what's going on behind the scenes in the play. Playwrights very carefully choose figure configurations. They use them to give a degree of informational significance about the figures and the situations in the play. So it's a strategic choice what configurations we choose, which characters, figures we put on stage with each other. That's a choice because two figures will have a special impact on each other and a special relationship with each other. And will create an effect. Think of it as figure chemistry. You put them together and an explosion of some sort happens, or some sort of a reaction happens. And I'm going to close out by just talking about a few different kinds of figures that are recurring. One is static figures. Okay, so static figures are figures in a play that don't undergo any kind of change or transformation. And you will hear some people say that every character must go through a transformation to be dramatic. I personally disagree with this, and I think that if you look at a lot of different plays out there, if you see that you're looking at a character that serves one function and that function never changes and their perspective never changes from the beginning of the play to the end, they're a static figure. They don't really undergo any kind of a change. Dynamic figures are figures that undergo some kind of a change, be it physical, personal, spiritual. You know, like Scrooge is a dynamic character. He starts off really mean, and then he's really nice at the end of the piece. He goes through a change, and we watch that. So dynamic figures are figures that go through some kind of a change. And then there are figures of different complexity. Monodimensional figures are figures that are defined by a very small set, sometimes even only one thing, but a small set of distinguishing features. There's a famous character named Mrs. Malaprop, and that name Malaprop, this is a Restoration comedy character, and her name means wrongly appropriated. And specifically, they're talking about the incorrect appropriation of meaning. She likes to use foreign words, but she always uses them in the wrong way. She doesn't understand the meaning of the words that she's using, and everyone around her sees this, but she thinks she's very sophisticated the whole time. She's a monodimensional figure because she is entirely identified by her belief that she is so smart. That is coupled with her misuse of language, and that proves that she actually isn't as smart as she thinks she is. Personification figures are figures where a concept or an abstract idea is put into a body. Every man, this is the whole point of the play. We see characters like penitence, characters like good deeds, characters like worldly goods, and they're all turned into human beings. And so they are personified. Type figures are recurring figures, sort of like you see in sitcoms, and they've been around forever, though. Stock characters, like the braggart soldier, the guy who thinks he's really, really brave and talks about what a great fighter he is, but really he's a coward, and when a fight breaks out, he runs away. The clever servant, the maid or the butler who's in charge of the house, and they're actually smarter than the people that they work for. So these are all types of figures. And then there's the individual figure. And that's a figure that's designed to be psychologically real. Like, so their reality is based on as many different elements as possible: their psychological state, their physical environment, their financial situation, their emotional state on the inside. So individual figures are designed to be as realistic as possible and to have as many human levels operating within them as possible. A closed figure is a figure who is clearly defined and unambiguous. And anything needed for definition has been provided by the playwright. A lot of type characters are that. If you're a braggart soldier, then in fact, you are closed, because we all know, oh, this is a guy and he's all about he's a coward who talks big. That's what he is. An open figure tends to be more ambiguous and mysterious, and we're not quite sure we understand him even by the end of the play, or understand her by the end of the play. Some of the defining information about these characters is is incomplete, or it might even contradict. We might see contradictory elements inside of a character. Hamlet is a really good example of an open figure. He is a mystery, and it remains a mystery through the entire play. Trans-psychological figures, that narrator we talked about before, who somehow knew everything that was going on in the world around in the play, but also knew that the audience was there. That's an example of a trans-psychological character. Other characters who know themselves so well, and they're able to speak about themselves with insane clarity that a normal person wouldn't have, they're a trans-psychological figure, because their awareness transcends the level of what is psychologically realistic. In this case, the character has often become an epic commentary character. So a narrator is telling us what's going on in another character's mind, and that is a form of epic. He's reporting to us, not representing what's going on in another character's mind. So they possess a degree of awareness and cognizance that they could not have possibly acquired from their own experiences. Psychological figures, tragic heroes of naturalism and realism, these suffer from a reduced level of awareness, and they're totally in control. They're totally controlled by fate, the environment around them. They're not usually represented as having a great deal of rational thought or capacity for speaking clearly. These are the naturalistic and the realistic characters, like a story about a gangster on the street who has no money and is, like Scarface. Think Scarface. That character doesn't really have a lot of articulating power. Not really rational. It's totally emotional driven character, and he is kind of pushed into what he does through bad environments. Often naturalistic and realistic characters have problems like psychological trauma, intoxication issues. A lot of times psychological figures are suffering from things. I mean, they almost seem to be suffering from more than most people, because their very mental nature is formed by the problems that we watch them dealing with throughout their play. And they have very little control over their environment. And it's surprising, because while you usually see the psychological figure in a naturalistic or a realistic play, you often see them in strange, absurd plays like Godot as well, because those characters are entirely at the mercy of their minds and entirely at the mercy of the environment in which they find themselves. So psychological figures aren't really a very positive, aren't usually a very positive representation of human beings, because they often are just almost slaves to every little factor that's impacting their mind. But of course, that's what makes them fun to watch, because they are struggling through a series of problems, and then we like to see them get over those problems or deal with those issues in interesting ways. That's part of the drama.